Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Bekah Legg. She's the CEO of Restored, a Christian charity working to speak up about violence against women and equip the church to stand against domestic abuse with survivors. Bekah's a former teacher and youth worker. She managed the youth work support line and relationships education programme for a sexual violence centre on the South Coast. Bekah has also published papers and lectures on a biblical understanding of domestic abuse and gender-based violence, and has spoken at the UN on the important role the church can and does play in ending violence against women and girls. And of course, she's got a bookstall at the back as well. Welcome to Bekah. Please come.
Thank you. It is so lovely to be here with you. I just listened to all of that and thought, oh, blimey, I didn't realise I'd done all of that. But it's a real privilege to be here, and I'm really enjoying the artwork. And enjoying seems like a funny word, doesn't it? Because they tell terrible stories of women who have been silenced, and women who have not been heard, women who have been pushed to one side, oppressed, abused, and left for dead in some cases. And it reflects a reality that is discovered in the Bible. There are so many of these stories that we skip over because they're not very nice. But they're in there, and I love that they're in there. I don't necessarily want to teach them in Sunday school. I'm glad that they're not making appearances in children's Bibles. But the fact that they're in the Bible, these stories of these women who've been so badly treated, shows us that God sees, and he hears, and he cares. And it tells us that actually this is a problem. Violence against women is a problem that has been going on since the dawn of time. And he has something to say about it. And that's what I want us to have a little talk about this evening. But I would love to introduce you to Restored first. Pearl, you did a lovely beginning of that, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more. So there is the mission which Pearl told you. So we exist. We've been around for nearly 15 years, speaking up about violence against women and girls. Our co-founders were at a UN World AIDS Conference back in 2008, and they heard story after story of women and men who had HIV, but one story in particular grabbed their attention. It was a story of a woman from Namibia, and her story was one of just having been taken and abused and raped time after time after time as a child, as a teenager, and as a woman. And that was why she was HIV positive, everything out of her hands. And our founders had said they had this experience of God's presence in that UN building in a way they'd never experienced it before. And they came up with two questions, because they said, it looks like violence against women just happens without anybody doing anything about it. No one's saying it's time to stop. So where's the church? And where are the men? And out of that came Restored, in a long story short. So that's who we are and what we do. But, actually, I'm going to skip past that one. Ooh, hang on, that's in a different order to my things. There we are. So we do a number of different things. And the first thing we do is we're very focused on domestic abuse, because over the years, what we came to recognise was that the form of violence that most women are most likely to experience is domestic abuse, hurt at the hands of someone who is meant to love them. And so we have an online community for Christian women in particular, because they face some extra barriers to safety and freedom and support. And we have nearly 750 women now from the UK in that online community receiving support in one shape or another. We have a number of tools that we use for that. We run recovery groups, we've got peer support groups, we've got online drop-ins, all manner of things. We're just starting to do some Survivor Church online for women who don't feel that they're able to go to church at the moment. But we also have this Survivor's Handbook, which I do want to point out to you. We've got some of those at the back. You can pay £10 for them, but we give them away free to survivors. So if that's what it's for, feel free to take them. But anytime someone pays for one, it enables us to give away more for free. But helpful to know that that's there. It's a resource that has a whole section on understanding domestic abuse, leaving an abuser, a section on recovery, and a section at the back that looks particularly at those faith questions that survivors often have that leave them feeling trapped where they are. But it's an excellent resource that I would definitely signpost people to alongside our Survivors Network. And I've got leaflets for those that you can take, have in your church, have in your handbag or your back pocket so that you can pass them on to somebody should they need them. Coming out of our Survivors Network, we recognise that what we do online transforms lives. And I have had the absolute privilege of seeing women who, when I met them online on a Zoom screen, were all curled up in the corner, scared to talk, unable to really think straight. And when I've met them months down the line or years down the line, meeting them, seeing them stand tall, being able to walk out and take on a job once again, to be independent, to learn and remember who they are, made in God's image, is the most wonderful thing. It's the most extraordinary privilege of my job. There's lots of challenges, but that's my favourite bit. But we know that what we do online would be so much better in person. It would be so much better if the local church was able to walk alongside women in the same way, to put on recovery groups, to be able to say, you are welcome in this place. You're not alone anymore. We'll walk with you as you remember who you are and who God made you to be. We'll signpost you to the services that you need. We'll come with you when it's all a bit daunting and scary. We'll help you get back on your feet. And so we've developed a network of churches that we call Restored Beacon Churches. And again, leaflet at the back that will tell you a little bit more about that if you're interested. But those churches choose to go on a journey that say, you are welcome here. You won't be silenced. We'll help you find your voice and we'll help you find your feet as well. And we go along doing that as we go. So I want us, though, to look at the story of a woman in the Bible who's not only silenced, we rarely hear her voice, but she doesn't even get to have a name. She's a woman with no name. We only get to know about her by the position she has in relation to a man. It's an extraordinary story that we find in the book of Judges. And if this were a film, if someone were to make a film of this story, and it's a pretty nasty story, it's the kind of film that would have to go on after 9 o'clock at night, would have to have an age rating on it. If this were a Netflix film, then I think it might start at the end. You might be one of those detective dramas, perhaps, so you can imagine it in your mind, that starts with a terrible crime or starts with a particular moment and leaves you trying to work out all the way through what's happened, what's gone on here, where is it? And so it finishes with this verse. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine. We must do something. There's an angry mob in a town square, and they're irate. Something's happened that's never been seen or done in Israel, in God's kingdom, they say. I'll get to that later. We must speak up. We must do something. They've been riled. They're outraged at something that has happened. And if this were a film or a Netflix drama, the credits might begin to roll and we're ready to get going as we settle down to see what's happened. Because this story begins, or this bit of the story begins. The people have come out into the town square because they've all received some pretty repulsive packages in the post. Or at least 12 of them have. The leaders of the tribes of Israel have received bloody packages, probably not in a cardboard box. Not entirely sure how they received them, but they've received body parts in the mail. What is going on in Israel? It's never been seen or heard. What is it? And so we need to zoom back to the beginning of the story. And this is where we discover our woman with no name. So the beginning of this story, and I'm not going to read it directly from the Bible, I'm going to tell the story and let you go home and read it for yourselves later. But this story begins with two characters. And we're told that we have a Levite and we have a concubine. And that is all we get to know about them, really, at this point. We don't ever get to know either of their names, but they're described fundamentally by their position. And so you have a Levite. So that means he's a priest. He's a man. It means that he's a man of high standing, someone that everyone looked up to and respected, somebody who got to teach the people in the community, and people followed what he said. People brought him gifts. People made sure that he had enough food on his table. He was highly respected. He was a man of great power in society. But the other person in this story is a concubine. It's his wife, but not really his proper wife, his kind of secondary wife. A wife who has all of the responsibilities, but none of the rights. She's somebody who has to do what she's told. She's somebody who has to perform when it's required. But she doesn't get much back in return. She's little more than a slave. And the story really quickly moves on from telling us who the story's about to telling us that something extraordinary happens. Because this woman who has no rights, very little power, whose husband has so much more power than her, she leaves him. And the Bible tells us that she was angered and she left and she goes back to her father's house. And in today's world of soap operas and dramas on TV, that isn't a great big surprise. But 3,000 years ago in Israel, that was shocking. It was shocking that she should leave her husband. Shocking that she should go back to her father. Shocking that her father would accept her and not send her back and say, no, this isn't where you belong. You're married. This is it. This is it for life. Off you go. But something has happened and she goes back to her father and she's there for quite a while before her husband, the Levite, the Bible tells us, decides that actually what he would like to do is to go and win her heart back. Which sounds lovely, doesn't it? Sounds romantic. Sounds like he's come and realised the error of his ways, whatever it is he did, the Bible doesn't tell us. And he's ready to go and win her heart back. And so he travels the distance to her father's house. And as he arrives, she welcomes him in. And it's interesting to note in the story that this is the last time that she takes an active role in anything that happens. So she welcomes him in to her father's house and they sit down for dinner. And the story continues and they have dinner and he stays a night. And night after night this happens for 5 nights. And the father says, no, don't go just yet. Don't go just yet. Stay another night. Have another meal. And we don't really know what was going on there. Commentators on the Bible have different ideas of what was going on. Some would say, well, the father's a bit embarrassed by his daughter. And so what he's trying to do is make up for her shameful behaviour. And others suggest that actually maybe the father's worried about his daughter, worried about this man with all the power, worried about the reason that the daughter came home. And he's just trying to hold on a little longer, keep her safe a little longer, make sure that everything's okay. And the Bible doesn't make it incredibly clear. But whatever the case, she's safe in her father's home for the next 3 or 4 nights, until eventually the Levites had enough. And he says, no, this is it. It's time. We need to get up. We need to go back. I've got my servant. I've got my donkey. Let's head home. And the father can't persuade him to stay any longer. And so this little group begin to make the journey home. And they leave quite late in the day. And it means that they can't make it home before nightfall. And it isn't safe in Israel 3,000 years ago to be out after dark. We talk about our streets not being safe now, but they weren't safe 3,000 years ago either. And so they look to the local town, Gibeah, to take refuge for the night. And they begin to set up camp in the town square. And then an extraordinary thing happens, because a man comes out of his house and he says, no, you can't stay out here. These streets aren't safe. Why don't you come in and stay with me? And it's a moment of extraordinary hospitality. It's a moment of incredible generosity as he welcomes these strangers in, fulfilling so much of the hospitality laws of the time. The Middle East was, a place of, really complicated laws of hospitality, and he's bringing them in and welcoming them in. And they settle down to eat dinner with this man and his daughter. It's a lovely scene. It's a lovely scene. And as dinner continues, and you can imagine the relief in the house of these travellers as they think, thank goodness we're not sleeping on the street tonight. Thank goodness that we're safe. Thank goodness we'll have a bed to rest our head on. Until there's a knocking on the door. And it's a big knocking. It's a loud knocking. And it's a knocking that if this was a film, if this was a Netflix drama, this is the moment at which the music in the background would be beginning to rise in that way that generally makes me go and make a cup of tea because I don't like the suspense. But it would be rising in that way that makes you know that something bad is about to happen. Something's going to happen that makes you jump. Something's going to happen that you would really rather didn't happen. But the master of the house goes and he opens the door. And outside, the Bible tells us, was a gang of evil men of wicked men, the wicked men of Gibeah. And he opens the door, and they demand that he sends out the Levite, the man. Send him out, they say, so that we can have our way with him. And it's pretty clear what they mean. It's not spelt out explicitly in the Bible, but it's pretty obvious. And the host of the house says, absolutely not. You must not do this vile thing. And he doubly prohibits it. You must not do it, and he calls it for what it is. You will not take and abuse the man in this house. And again, imagine being sat around that table. Imagine the relief, the fear that would have been building up with the knocking on the door and the demands from these angry men outside. And the relief as this man says, absolutely not. Not in my house. Not in my town. That isn't how we do things here. That's a little bit of Bekah ad-lib on the end, but essentially that's what he says. But then imagine how the women in that house feel as he continues to speak and says, instead, take my daughter and this man's wife and do what seems right in your own eyes. Can you imagine being a woman at that table? Can you imagine the fear that begins to fill in as you not only begin to recognize what might be about to happen, but for that daughter who realizes her dad doesn't give her any value, to that wife as she recognizes that her life does not have the same value as that of the man that she's accompanying. That there's two standards in this house. There's hospitality for the men. There's protection for the men. But the women, well, they can be sacrificed for the men, to keep them alive, to keep them safe, to keep them clean. It would have been a terrible moment. It would have been horrible. And actually, the daughter is safe because the Levite grabs his wife and pushes her out of the door so fast and closes it behind her that the daughter stays safe in the house. Unbelievable. A man who verses before has gone to win her heart back, never apparently actually speaks to her, only to her father. And then when it comes to it, she's so dispensable that he can just use her and sacrifice her to save himself. What a guy. And what happens next, the Bible mercifully doesn't go into great detail. It would be X-rated, but it's really clear that she is taken by this gang and she's abused and she's raped all night long, and her body is left for dead in the morning on the footstep of the door. It's a horrible story. Doesn't belong in our children's Bibles. And in the morning, when the Levite wakes up and decides it's time to go home, I always hope he didn't sleep very well, but we don't know. But as he wakes up and he begins his journey home, he finds her body on the doorstep, and he must have almost tripped over it. And the extraordinary thing is that he's horrified to find her there, outraged that this should have happened. And he picks up her body, and the Bible isn't completely clear that she's dead. Lifeless body, certainly. She might be dead, or she might just look dead. And he picks up her body, and he throws it over his donkey, and he takes her home. And then he cuts up her body into 12 pieces and puts it into those 12 packages and sends it to the 12 tribes of Israel, outraged at what's happened to his wife, as if he had nothing to do with it. It's an extraordinary, awful story. And it's the reason why, I'll go to that one in just a moment, it's the reason why the men come out in the middle of the night, in the morning, and they come out and they're outraged, and they say, has such a thing ever been seen or done? Has such a thing ever been seen or done? We must speak up. We must do something. But it's a difficult story. It's a difficult story for so many reasons. It's a difficult story because we don't like it. It's a difficult story because it talks about things we'd rather not think about. It's a difficult story because it makes us sit really uncomfortably in our seats. And for some of us, it presses buttons that are too close to home. But it's a story that has been taken and interpreted differently over the years. And it's a story that makes us wonder, well, where is God in this story? Where is he? Why is this story in our Bible? Well, firstly, because it shows us that God sees, he knows, and he cares. But where is God? Some people have taken this story, and I will jump on now, and they've changed it. And I told you I wasn't going to read it from the Bible. That's because we've all got different translations, and it gets written in different ways. But this story is quite extraordinary. If you look at verse 2, and I told you that she left because she was angry with her husband. But depending on the translation of your Bible, it might say something really rather different. You see, in one translation, it says she was angry. And in another version, it says that she was unfaithful. And we might be able to explain that because leaving your husband at all was really being unfaithful. But the other version says that she was a whore. Well, that's very different, isn't it? One version, she's a woman who was wronged right from the start by a bad man. And in the last version, well, some people suggest that this is just a story of what happens to bad women. It's divine judgment on women who don't know how to behave. Well, which is it? What should it be? Well, if you study and look back and begin to think through the laws of the time, what makes sense? Well, the truth is, the punishments for adultery, let alone prostitution, were vicious and they were harsh. And no father in the land would have accepted his daughter back under that kind of a shame. And no husband actually would have wanted to go and win her heart back. It doesn't really make sense. What makes sense is that something happened in that house that was so extreme and so bad that this woman, against all the customs of all the time, thought, I have to leave and I have to go back to where I'm safe with my father. And it matters how we look at these stories. It matters how we tell the stories of the women who have been silenced. It matters that we don't take it and we don't twist it and we don't make it fit our agenda and our narrative of how we want the world to look. You see, if you look at the early church fathers, they said that she was angry with him. And it wasn't until medieval times that a theologian called Bucer decided that actually she was a whore. Because it suited his agenda. It suited him that this was much better that this be a cautionary story for bad girls. Behave yourselves, girls, because look what happens to girls who don't. But there's something else going on here as well, because is this what happens to bad girls? Well, actually, the truth is, I think I need that verse. This verse begins, or this story begins and ends with this phrase. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. This is the time of the Judges. This is a time when, if you know the book of Judges, and if you don't, I'll catch you up. The book of Judges fits at a time in the story of God's people when God's people had come out of Egypt where they lived in slavery under a wicked Pharaoh with Moses. I'm going to do a really fast track through the Bible now. And they'd moved and they'd come across, so they'd taken 40 years through a wilderness to get to their promised land. And they'd entered the promised land with a leader called Joshua who had taken them in. And it had been a time of flourishing. It had been a time of goodness. It had been a time of good crops and security and following God. And then Joshua died. And then you enter the time of the Judges. And it's a time when actually God's people slowly but surely enter this decline as they slowly but surely get into this kind of like spiraling of not really following God anymore, beginning to get distracted by other things, looking to other places for their security. And as you read through the book of Judges, there's this spiraling down of their morals, of their economics, of their politics, of their society, and of the way that they treat women. In the time of the Judges, when everyone did what seemed right in their own eyes, not in God's eyes, this isn't a cautionary tale of what God does to bad girls. This is a story of what happens when the world turns its back on a God who loves them and who shows them a better way of living. This is a story of what happens at the pit of a godless people. This, along with quite a few of the other stories that you read alongside it, show what happens in a godless, lawless world. And it's interesting because that refrain is echoed in the words of the man of the house when he's speaking to those men outside saying, do what seems right in your own eyes. He's not suggesting it's right in God's eyes. He's acknowledging that here are some men who are out of control and frankly a little bit frightening. Do whatever seems right to you. I'm having nothing to do with this. As if that absolves him of any part in what happens next. It's so easy to try and step outside. I had a conversation just over dinner with somebody who was talking about, how hard it is when men around him have really difficult conversations in the way they speak about women. And I loved how he challenged his friends. But it's so easy to just let it go. Do what seems right in your own eyes. Or do we say, this is wrong, don't do this vile thing, as he had just before? So, it leaves us with the men of Israel, the men and women of Israel gathered in a square. So we must speak up. We must do something. And the first time I ever preached on this was in June 2020. And it was just after the murder of George Floyd, the African-American who was murdered by a policeman. And we'd seen the Black Lives Matter kind of really explode. And it was the same week as I was preaching. And as I preached, I thought, do you know what? I think this was a little bit like that. Because George Floyd was not the first black man to be killed by an American policeman, by a long shot. He was not the first dodgy police killing. And yet something about that story captured the collective imagination and brought people together in holy outrage saying, this cannot happen anymore. It has to stop. It has to stop. And the truth is, this woman was not the first woman to be treated terribly in Israel. There's no way, these things don't just happen. They happen as a society spirals down in the way that it treats a section of society, whether that's women or people of a different race or a different ethnicity or whatever it is. This had been going on, but something in this story, probably the packages through the door, made them go, this must stop. We have to speak up. We have to do something. And it's so easy with a story like this to go, absolutely. Absolutely. What a terrible time those people lived in. Wasn't it shocking? I'm so glad I didn't live 3,000 years ago. They were barbaric. Or we can allocate it geographically and go, oh my gosh, that part of the world, even today, it's terrible. I'm so glad I live in safe Bristol. I'm so glad that I live in my little leafy suburb, or wherever it is that we live. I'm so glad that I don't live in such a time and place. But the truth is, we do live in such a time and place. Things haven't changed so much. And this call of God's people, a friend of mine made me a fridge magnet out of it, which is probably the only one in the world, I should think, because I'd said, this is the kind of thing we should have on our walls, because it's a call of God's people from 3,000 years ago saying, this has to stop. We can't treat women like this anymore. We have to do something different. Speak up and do something. Because it is still going on. Here's some statistics for you. In the last year, this is a little old, so these numbers will be even higher now. Globally, 9 million girls were forced to have sex, just like our concubine. Again, slightly old stats. This is clicking on very quickly sometimes. But more girls have been killed in the last 50 years because they were girls, not for any other reason. So we're thinking about girls who've been aborted because they were girls, girls who've been killed because they were girls, girls who've been killed for honour killings, girls who've been killed because of all kinds of things, but fundamentally because of their gender, than all the men killed in all the wars in the 20th century. When you think about it like that, it's horrifying. But we don't talk about it. We don't speak up. Here's it put slightly differently. More girls killed in the last decade because they were girls than all of those killed in all of the genocides of the 20th century. More than the 6 million Jews in World War II. More than the 1 million people who got killed in the Rwandan genocide. More than all of it and all of the other genocides that we've seen. The gender side is more extreme still. And when you begin to narrow that down, every single day globally, 137 women are killed. Not just because they're girls, but by people who were meant to love them. Husbands, fathers, boyfriends. And when you bring that back to our country, the England and Wales statistics say that every week, on average, 2 women are killed by somebody who was meant to love them. That's a lot. That's more than 100 a year by somebody who was meant to love them. And that isn't even adding in Scotland and Ireland. And when we think about our young people, and we think about what's going on there, this is a little jumpy clicker. There was a report that came out in two reports came out in 2021. This one was by UN Women UK. And they said 97% of women aged 18 to 24 will be sexually harassed, which is basically all of them. It's basically all of them. And then just a month later, Ofsted released a report about our schools and said our schools have a rape culture. And if we don't understand what that means that we've just normalised violence against women. We've just normalised sexual abuse. But I've got another image of what it means, which actually happened in a church just down the road, Alma Road. And I was doing the same talk, actually, or a very similar talk, and I'd said this statistic. And at the end, a girl came to talk to me, a young lady, she was a student, and she said, Bekah, what's wrong with the 3%? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, what about the 3% who haven't been sexually harassed? Why haven't they been? What's wrong with them? And I heart broke, because I knew that meant she thought she was in the 3%. And she thought that meant there was something wrong with her. Because our culture says that what makes you a woman is when you have men desiring after you in a way that is harassment, in a way that makes you uncomfortable, in a way that makes you feel like you've got no choice. And to not have had that, the truth is that made her exceptionally fortunate. And what she felt was there's something wrong with me because I'm not getting that attention. And it broke my heart, and I had quite a long conversation with her, frankly. But something is really, really wrong in our culture. Something is really, really wrong in our country. And something is really, really wrong in our church. Because Restored went on this journey of being against violence against women and girls. And then we realised that domestic abuse was the form of violence most women are most likely to experience. And then we realised that it was really bad within churches. And so we did some research in 2018 to try and understand what the prevalence of domestic abuse was within the church. And we came to realise that it was as prevalent within the church as it is outside. So 1 in 4 churchgoers have been subjected to domestic abuse, which is the same statistics as outside. But the people who went to church took 3 times as long to ask for help. And that horrified us. And that is what has spurred us on to do everything that we do now to support survivors and to equip the church to make itself a space where people don't take so long to ask for help, where people do feel they can speak up, they do feel they can ask and they can get support. It matters that we create spaces that are like that. But if we were to go back to that verse in Judges 19, to speak up and to do something, what does it actually look like? Well, it can look like something enormous. And this is a picture of the vigil that was held after Sarah Everard got killed. That was in 2021 as well. Where they had this kind of like very intense few months when people were saying, we must speak up, we must do something. And there were vigils on Clapham Common. And there were things going on all over the place. And I think there were some students in Bristol even who did a march saying, we're going to make these streets safe. It was an incredible moment. But those moments pass and they move on. So what does it look like for us? How do we change the story for women? How could we change the story, for example, for that concubine? What might have changed her story? Well, there's all kinds of characters going in there, but imagine if that Levite, when he was training to be a priest, had received some really excellent training on equality between men and women. Imagine if he'd got taught what relationships are meant to look like. Imagine if he'd had a mentor and accountability who held him accountable for the way that he treated the women in his life, who cared, who stepped in, who spoke up. Imagine if her dad had felt able to step against the culture. Imagine if the culture enabled him to say, she's not coming home with you. I'm not confident she's safe. She's hurting and she needs to stay with me. Imagine if he'd felt able to do that because their culture wasn't so strong that it said the wife must just go home to her husband. There's a lot that needed to change for those men of Gibeah, the wicked men who banged on the door. So much needed to happen in their parenting. So much needed to happen in their schooling. So much needed to happen in the culture that was created all around them to change their behaviour. And what if that host had just been raised to know that you protect women and men? Nobody gets sacrificed for anybody. Imagine the difference in that story. You see, it's so easy to write off this story and go, well, it's just some wicked men. Just some wicked men, but it wouldn't happen here because we're not wicked. Well, there's a story in our news, wasn't it, at the end of last year that I think really challenged a lot of us to recognise that it isn't just the evil Knievel in the corner that we might expect to be the baddie in a film that does these terrible, wicked things. It really can be any of us. If you think about that case of Giselle Pellicot in France, that incredibly brave woman who stood in the court and gave witness to what her husband had done to her, drugging her, enabling and inviting other men to come in and abuse her. She was so brave, but it woke France up and it woke the world up really to these just ordinary men. But it's not every man. And please hear me when I say that. I don't think that for a minute. But it isn't always straightforward. We have to create a culture which says, we don't think like this. We think a bit more like God. You see, we need to think about our culture because it matters. I want to go into a very quick rush through why domestic abuse happens. There's a man called Lundy Bancroft who's worked with perpetrators of domestic abuse for years, and he talks about a tree. He talks about the acts that we see in domestic abuse as these behaviours, and he says they're like fruits, and you could pluck a fruit off or stop somebody from doing physical harm, but things will keep growing back because fundamentally this is about control. This is about this is about somebody. The fruits enable somebody to, oh, you can't read that. The branches say control, the trunk says entitlement, and it's growing in this kind of sense that the perpetrator owns their partner. You're mine. I can do whatever I want with you. I'm entitled to get what I want from you. I need to control you. I'm going to control you. And those fruits are just how I do it. It might be physical violence. It might be sexual violence. It might be isolating you or economically constricting you. But he wasn't the first person to talk about a tree and fruits. Jesus was. And he said, by your fruits you'll be known. And Paul goes on and talks about the fruits of the Spirit later on in the letters Paul's letters, a little bit later on. But when I've looked at this and I've thought about it, I've thought, you know what? This tree's great, but actually what really matters is the soil that this is growing in. How can we change that soil? How can we change a culture that enables it? And that's the challenge I really want to give you guys tonight as you think, gosh, we've heard a lot. What can we do? How do we speak up and do something? Well, having a vigil up on the Downs might be grand. But what can we do in the everyday? What are the little things that we can begin to do? And I want to give you this question for a minute, perhaps to talk about the people just next to you. Where can you improve the quality of the soil in your community? And it's possible I've taken the tree metaphor too far. Okay, so I'll stop there. I was going to talk about fertiliser and all sorts, and I thought, no, I am definitely one who can push a metaphor too far. But imagine this. Perhaps just with the person next to you, just over the next 5 minutes, have a little conversation. Say, where do you see the toxic culture in your community? Are there stories locally? Have you heard things in conversations in spaces that you go? Have you noticed things? Have you seen stories in the news? Where have you noticed a culture that enables this kind of violence, this kind of doing down of women, just to continue and proliferate? What does it look like? How do you recognise it? And then I want you to think about how might you combat it. Is there a way? It doesn't mean we'll achieve anything necessarily. It doesn't mean that we can go and immediately fix and make Bristol a place of equality and wonder for everybody. But are there some small things you could do that mean that you're not just saying, oh, do what seems right in your own eyes. You're saying, don't do this vile thing. Is there a way? Can you think of some things that you might be able to do? I've got some ideas after that, but I'm going to let you guys, I've talked for quite a long time, you've probably had enough. So I'm going to let you guys talk to each other and then we'll feed that back in. And let me give you 5 minutes, and at 5:15, we'll feed that back. Is that okay? I'll draw you back, if that's okay. And I'm not going to take feedback right here and now because I'm really conscious of time. But it's good to have these conversations. It's good to acknowledge it because it's when we acknowledge it that we can begin to change things. But I did just want to give you some ideas of mine, that of things you can do. Sam asked me if I could have some takeaways for you guys, little things that you can do, because sometimes there are great big things we can do, but it's the little things that are so often add up and quickly become really effective. So if we want to change the story in our community, what can it look like? Well, first of all, as people of faith, we can pray. And that seems really trite and really simple, but it makes a real difference. And it might look like gathering a couple of friends. It might look like just, occasionally in your small groups, whatever you call them in your church that you go to, that's a moment to go, actually, this week, let's pray for survivors of domestic abuse. Let's pray for our local services. Let's pray about the situation all together. Join us on Mondays at Restored. We have a prayer meeting at 1:30. Anyone is welcome. You just need to sign up. You might like to use our liturgy. I've got a church guide here. There's some liturgy in the back. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. You might like to use that to just take a moment in a church service to pray about it. And at that point, it becomes more than, and more, well, it's not more than, because prayer's quite a lot in itself, isn't it? I don't want to be heretic. But at that point, you also say to your church, this is something we talk about. This isn't a taboo subject. This is something that we recognise is wrong, might be happening here, and you might need to talk about. And you've immediately begun to stop the silence. You've begun to open the door. Now you can speak up. This is where it comes back to our mission. And that can look like lots of things. It might just look as simple as sharing a social media post from Restored, from Women's Aid, from somebody else who's doing it. And you just say, I'm speaking up. And the people who know you will recognise that you've done that. And you're beginning to share the story. You're beginning to say something different. You might want to speak to someone in leadership in your church and say, hey, could we get a speaker to come and talk about this? Can we talk about this in our church? That might be something that you do, raise awareness where you are. You can do things to support survivors. You might want to buy and make sure that you've got some copies of the book in your church so that if someone needs them, they can get hold of them. You might want to take some of these leaflets about our Survivors Network. So again, if somebody needs them, they can find them. You don't need to be an expert. You need to signpost the experts and say, oh, I know where you can find some help. You might be able to do that. You might want to support your local services in some shape or form. They're always desperate for help of any kind, and they'd love that. It would be something amazing that you can do. I'm going to skip through that one for a minute. And you can equip your church. I talked about speaking to your church leader, but it might be that you say, actually, what I want to do is do some training. At Restored, we offer online training all of the time. We'll very happily get in the car and come and train a whole church if that's what people would like. But you get educated. The way that we can begin to change the story is by understanding the story in the first place, understanding what's going on. And we can do that through training. We might do it through picking up this. This church guide is something that we've created to be able to help churches recognise and respond to domestic abuse inside their church and out in their community. And it's got so much gold dust in here about what domestic abuse is and how as church we respond when we think we see it happening around us. We might like to start a Bristol conversation about restored beacons. And there's a couple of people I might wink at in the room because I'm priming them already. But there isn't a restored beacon in Bristol at the moment. There isn't a church that says loud and, proud, we're a safe space. You come here, we'll believe you, we'll listen to you, and we'll walk with you. Wouldn't it be wonderful if across Bristol we had a couple of churches who were really determined to be a centre, like a hub, a safe space, where actually more churches said, we're going to make sure that we've got people trained to know how to respond if this comes up in our community. We want to make sure that the men and the women and the children who are affected by this in our communities are able to find refuge and support. There's so many things. Now, that last one is a very big thing, but I'm working on it. But the smaller things, the prayers, the books, the signposts, it might be on our website we've got posters that you can put on the back of toilet doors. One's for women, one's for men. So that anybody who comes in goes, oh, this church talks about this, and it signposts me to where I can find support. Simple little things that we can do to begin to change the story. But Judges 19 leaves us with a challenge. How can we speak up? And how can we do something? And I leave that challenge with you tonight. Thank you.
Or comments or
there might not be any.
Nick. Go on then, Nick.
The figures you give me shock me, quite rightly. I was vaguely aware that they might be like that. I'm trying to find out why we have got it so wrong. And a thought, and it is only a thought, we've tried to denigrate sex.
Yeah.
The church and the other faiths, they're all the same, have denigrated it, so being healthy doesn't exist, which gives a vacuum for being unhealthy.
Oh, that's interesting. There's a lot in that.
It's a thought.
I tell you, I have quite a lot to say about as church, and I've been a youth leader, so I've probably been guilty of this at some points, although actually I think I tried quite hard not to be like it. We've just talked about not having sex, and we haven't talked about actually what do healthy relationships look like, and I think that is a really, really important... You know, the way we combat this is by talking about what good looks like, and that's a really important thing. But where this has gone wrong is it's not just about sex, it's about how we treat one another, it's about respect. And, you know, if you were to go back to the beginning of Genesis and the fall, what we see happen is actually this desire for power over beginning right back at the fall. And that's really what that temptation is about. You shall be like God. You'll have all that power. And the minute that happens, like, humankind becomes like infected, really, with this need for power over. And we create all these different institutions to have power over somebody else. And that sometimes looks like forcing sex, but sometimes it looks like making people slaves. It looks like all kinds of things. And we created structures that put those power imbalances into place. Abuse is always about somebody having power over somebody else, just like that Levite and the concubine. And the first power imbalance that we see is male and female. He shall rule over you, which isn't, you know, God saying that's how it must be. It's him saying, oh, this is what's going to happen because everything's gone wrong now. You know, this is what it's going to look like. But then we see humankind put that in around, you know, we put power imbalances in, and we structure it in through race, or whether or not I look right and you don't look right, whether or not I'm blonde and you're not, whether or not you're the same race as me, or the same religion as me, or the same ability as me. We've created or the same class. We create all these things to make me better than you and have power over. And fundamentally, that isn't who Jesus was. And when he came, he showed a really, you know, it's so twee and easy to say he showed a different way. But I love that verse in the Bible, in Philippians 2. I never used to have a favourite verse, but now I do. And it's this one, where it's talking about, it says Jesus, who was in every, you know, he was made in the likeness of God, and yet he didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Jesus, cosmic Jesus, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, creator of everything, almighty cosmic power. And he never once played the God card. He didn't come down and go, don't you know who I am? He never came down and zapped people. He never used that power over people. He gave people choice. He gave people options. He invited people to follow him, but he never made anybody do anything. And I think that's the extraordinary thing that's what we're meant to live like, be like Christ. And yet we live in this world where we try and have power over. And it then spins out into all these other things. But the fundamental problem is power. That was a long answer, sorry.
Thanks, Bekah, for your energy and your insights tonight. Load of rambling thoughts I've had. Do you feel daunted? Don't have to answer at the moment. When I say daunted, I think about Musk and Zuckerberg and the whole big movement that is massive, powerful, with lots of money. Schools, what can we do with schools? How can we support teachers? 12 hours ago, you were probably doing something very sensible. I was just listening to the radio about Gareth Southgate, talking about the lost boys, the problem with young men. So, although all seems so difficult and culturally challenging, I feel there is a greater awareness. But how do you keep going? Don't you feel daunted?
I feel really daunted quite a lot. But I also have moments where I see really wonderful things. I was speaking at a men's conference last summer, was in a field near Swindon, and I'd been invited to come and talk about what women really want, and I turned it into what women really want you to know, and which was slightly naughty of me, but I did. And but I wasn't really looking forward to it. I thought I'd get 30 men in a tent heckling me, and I actually ended up with 1,000 men who asked the best questions and wanted to know exactly that. I'm a teacher. How can I influence the boys in my school? I work on a construction site. Why don't we start a campaign to make it so that girls don't walk past construction sites in fear, waiting to be whistled at or yelled at? And I just heard all these amazing things from around the room, and that helped me not feel so daunted. I was like, oh, yay, this is exciting. And so it is daunting, and everything that's going on across the Atlantic at the moment is horrible and daunting and feels like everything's going back 6 steps. What's happened in Afghanistan makes you feel like everything's gone back even more steps. And it's this constant battle, but I think there's this moment where you go back to Judges 19, this has been going on for so long, we're not going to fix it in a flash, but we can make sure that we are light in the darkness, and we can make sure that we are agents of change in our community, and that we are challenging and changing a toxic culture, and hopefully just putting little pools of good around that show a different way. And, when it comes to boys, boys, I think we have got a lost generation of boys who need a lot of positive input into their lives. So it isn't Andrew Tate, it's not Elon Musk, it's not these other people who are feeding poison in. I'll go back to my soil culture in a minute and get back to that. But can we tell a different story and give them a different model of positive masculinity that's really exciting? Yeah.
I'm just a little bit curious about how many or what portion of abused people would actually be able to come to where the books and the leaflets are, because surely the abuser will stop the abused person getting there.
That's a really good question, and it's why we need to be really careful when we are trying to support people, because you can put people at great risk. So one of the things that we can do as church is to hold this stuff and to have it available, and to say, well, if, this is something, we doesn't need to go back to your house, doesn't need to go, you can come and read the book in our church when you've got a moment and it's safe. One of the things that we encourage churches to do is to be able to say, well, look, if we need to start exploring some options, you could use our computer, because computers, phones, survivors, if people who are being subjected to domestic abuse use their own electronic devices, they're probably being checked, they're probably being tracked. There's so much that's fraught with danger. So actually creating a safe space is a step forward. Doesn't mean we can guarantee somebody can come and read it, but we can try and leave bits of information in different places. It's why things like posters on the back of a toilet door are because that is a little safe space where most people go on their own. And you actually have got a moment to take a phone number or to think, oh, that's me, I could do something. But it's very good to be aware of not putting people at more risk when it comes to it.
Just picking up on that point, we have a prayer box outside our church, and people drop in cards with prayers anonymously. Ooh. And we collect them every week, and we pray for them in the church. And there's been a significant proportion, I imagine, of women who've just dropped something in the little box because there's nowhere else for them to go, about their menfolk treating them badly. Oh. So it's out there, yeah. And the fact that they resort to just writing something anonymously and dropping it in a box where nobody sees them, perhaps that's the reason, but who knows. But anyway, that was a feedback. But I wanted to say there is a climate abroad that is in the pursuit of perfection, and we're on the road where we get the young girls walking up to school. And the conversations one hears about sending photographs and doing yourself up so that you can make the image more perfect than the actual real thing, so that your boyfriend expects to see that he too gets these images. And then when he's confronted with the real thing, he must be terribly disappointed. And that can lead to, you're not what my expectation of womankind is. I want you to send me photographs of yourself doing all sorts of things. And this is something we'll share between us. And before they know it, it's gone the rounds. Yeah,
there's a real problem with... I think that same Ofsted report talked about, there are some girls, it's not every girl, being asked up to 13 times a day to send nude photos of themselves. And when it comes to the photos and the pressure on girls to look perfect, well, it's all part of the same problem, because they're being seen as something that is a possession that has to be perfect, has to be pristine. Yeah, and unattainable, and they can't. And so it's that, and telling girls to go, there's so many conversations to be had about so much of this. And the people who need to have those conversations are the parents, but parents often don't know how to begin to have those conversations. We've put together a webinar, a seminar actually, to help parents think about how to have those conversations. Because you can't just leave it to school. It needs to be everywhere. We all need to be having these conversations all of the time to say, this is not what girls, your value does not lie in being perfect and attractive to a man. That isn't where your value lies. Your value lies somewhere else, so that they can just go, oh, shove off to boys who ask them to send them nudes. I mean, that's a really good response, frankly. If we can give girls the confidence that they don't, that isn't what's the most important thing about you, but it's a hard thing when all the messaging coming at them from everywhere else says something different. It's really important. Thank you.
Can you use the mic?
Yeah, use the mic so it gets picked up for the recording.
Sorry,
Sorry, I just wandered in from
That's all right.
the street and saw this was happening some days ago, so I thought I'd come in and hear what's going on. My question is about the example of women in discipleship in the Gospels and how women are valued in terms of how Jesus engaged with women and engaged with men. And my understanding or my feeling is that I'm not sure that the women that were also disciples are necessarily being seen in the Christian or valued. I'm not talking about women being priests and all of that. I'm talking about setting a context when teaching Scripture, the value of women, value of daughters, and how those women have contributed, even if they're not named in Scripture, but at least to allow the fact that we consider the potential that women were around. Women did participate.
100%.
Women did not run away when Christ was about to be crucified. They hung about while the men ran away, things like that. I know I'm being a bit radical, but I would just like to see men and women in church every week understanding that women had a place in Scripture, and they're not quoted in the Scripture, but they were there.
Women have been written out. Some of those stories have been written out. Some of those women have been given boys' names because it was too inconvenient for them to be in there. I think it really matters that from our pulpits we are telling the stories of the women, and we're talking about how I don't think you're radical. Jesus was really radical in the way that he treated women. He was so counter-cultural in the dignity that he gave to the women around him and the way that he treated them. Story after story of women that society would have shunned or stoned, and he gave them dignity and he gave them time. And their stories, we miss it, don't we? In today's culture, it's not like they're just women. But for them to have had the roles that they had at the time that they lived was so extraordinary that we need to bring that radicalness. Don't think that's a word, but you know what I mean. Radical something. Yeah, just see them. And know and understand what that meant, that Jesus saw them means such a lot. And that's why I love this art installation. It's so brilliant because it's giving a lot of those, it's recognising so many of those women. Really matters. Thank you.
Can I be really cheeky and have a question? Just one last one. It seems to me when you look at what's going on nationally, there are many women who stand up against violence against women. Where are the good men?
That's such a good question. I'm going to flip back to my slides. There we are, engaged men. I skipped over it earlier because it's really interesting. I said at the beginning that when Restored started, there were two questions. Where's the church? So we tackled that quite well, but where are the men? And initially there was a campaign that Restored began called The First Man Standing. And it was launched at a big men's conference. Over 1,000 men signed up. It was amazing. And it was this idea of how do you have these conversations with your mates in the locker room when they're talking about women in a derogatory way? How do you stand up for the woman in the pub who's being, harassed? How do we do that in a way that isn't escalating violence but is just making a difference? How do we do those things? How do we have the conversations with our boys in our workplaces? How do we do all of those things? I've been working at Restored for about 5 years, and when I arrived, the First Man Standing had gone quite quiet, but I was just having a conversation today about how I really feel like God is nudging Restored back into this conversation, and actually it's time to start engaging men again. And we had an event last week speaking at UNCSW, which is Commission for the Status of Women. It's over in New York, but I was on Zoom. It's hardly as exciting. But we were talking about the importance of engaging men, because this isn't just a women's issue, and there are some outstanding men doing incredible things. And some of them are doing great big things that you can see, and some people are just, it's their everyday conversations and the way that they're raising their sons, or the conversations they're having in the workplace. But how can we grow that and encourage it and equip men to be doing that more? So I'm going to say watch this space. Stuff is coming, but as Restored, we really want to relaunch First Man Standing and see how that can roll out into not just engaging individual men, but maybe going into schools, maybe having those conversations in universities, maybe equipping local church to really start challenging culture in their community. But there's a really critical role for men in this, and we're on it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to Bekah. Would you like to show your